I will say, you said, the overall public policy response has been very bad in the world of all Republicans, Democrats, independents, whatever you want to say. The media, I think, in general, does deserve a grade worse than F, which is what you said. I'm actually somewhat encouraged that sports got much of this right. And it was a battle to get it right. But when we talked back on August 21st, we didn't know whether college football 100% was going to happen. We now have crowned a champion. We did not know whether the NBA was going to be able to finish their season. They did in the bubble. Now they're out of the bubble in the next season. Major League Baseball finished their season with fans present in Texas. The NFL has played their entire schedule so far. We're talking in the week of the AFC and the NFC championship games. All of those sports, not to mention countless high schools, as well as other sports that are not anywhere near as popular on a collegiate level or a professional level. Avik, there isn't a single death or even serious illness that has been connected to coaching or athletics. And the coaches are obviously older than the players. But that's what the data told us was likely to happen. And people are like, oh, wow, this actually ended up being possible. Thankfully, they took the chance and tried to figure out a way to make it happen. What letter grade would you give sports leagues for their willingness and ability to play once they came back? Certainly NASCAR's involved, tennis, all these other different sports. And are you at least as appreciative as I am that we found a way to get that done and that the data showed, lo and behold, that it was safe and it was possible to do?
Definitely appreciative, and not just that they did it for the sake of the athletes who obviously work so hard for those opportunities, but for the rest of us who, just as human beings, we needed something that was not political, or at least mostly not political, and that we could point to and cheer about in our lives in this very challenging year we've just had. So I'm grateful to the sports leagues that worked hard to make it happen. And you've covered it on your show. It's not like the sports league said business as usual. There's a lot of stuff, a lot of work, a lot of testing, a lot of restrictions on attendance by the fans that went into keeping sports going in a cautious and prudent way. And hopefully they've learned from that to realize, okay, maybe we can loosen it up a little bit now that we've learned that we can do this safely and operate safely. But what it really comes back to in my mind, Clay, is what you said at the beginning: capitalism, right? The financial incentive for sports leagues to stay open was a big driver of why they did stay open. And now at the time, last summer, last early fall, August, September, that was, the sports pundits said this is so terrible. These leagues, particularly in terms of college sports where, there's the conflict between amateurism and the money. These leagues are putting money ahead of humanity. They're so greedy and so terrible. And I look at it in exactly the opposite way. It was the financial or economic incentive which motivated them to get it right, to figure out, hey, there's got to be a way to do this safely. We're going to lose a lot of money if we don't figure out how to do it safely. So let's figure it out. And exactly the same dynamic, Clay, is true with schools. So why is it that private schools around the country are open and public schools are not? First of all, you don't have teachers unions in private schools. But a big part of it is, if you're that private school, if you're running a private school and you say, no, we're going to go to Zoom, everyone's going to disenroll. No one's going to show up at that school, and your school is going to go broke because you're not going to get any tuition dollars in the door. Whereas in the public schools, the money is flowing regardless of what you do. So why keep the school open when you're going to get paid either way? So the economic or financial incentives were absolutely a critical driver of why public schools have been closed, but why sports leagues and private schools were open.
God, it's so well said. I mean, it 100% is. Now, not surprisingly, the sports media mostly, there are exceptions, you're listening to one of them, but the sports media mostly followed the lead of the national media in making the arguments there's no way that it's safe to play, right? CBS Sports, for example, I talked about this a lot on my radio program. They had an expert, and you know how this works. The experts that say the things that don't make headlines, oh yeah, there's definitely a way to play sports. That doesn't make the headline. The expert who comes out and literally at CBS Sports guaranteed a football player would die and predicted there would be at least 3 to 7, as if he were Joe Namath back in the day. He guaranteed a death and said he predicted that there would be 3-7. That's a headline at CBS Sports. They finished the season in college football, and that's what he was specifically making his prediction about. Everybody is fine. There are no issues. And the story just disappears, right? There's no consequence for an expert, and I'm putting that in quotation marks, being 100% wrong, particularly when those people have tenure at universities. It's like it's impossible for them to ever have a consequence, and that probably goes back to your point. In a market-based economy, if you're wrong, you lose your job. In a university setting, if you're wrong, you just write a new article explaining why you were wrong and or completely ignoring it,
or just ignore it.
There's no consequence.
Yeah, in fact, you're reminding me of I can't remember which media organization it was. It may have been ESPN. It may have been Yahoo or CBS. Lots of people. There was the Big 12 expert that the Big 12 ADs recruited, who said, actually, you can operate the league safely, and here's how you do it. And there was a round of articles criticizing
That's right.
the Big 12 and that expert, saying, oh, the Big 12 just went doctor shopping and found some idiot off the street who was going to validate what they wanted to do and not listen to the science. Right. And that guy turned out to be right. And everyone else turned out to be wrong, at least the ones that say the Big Ten was listening to.
It is. I mean, and all of this, and again, to kind of relitigate some of this, you remember the myocarditis story that flared up. Oh my God, if you get COVID, you're going to get myocarditis. Your heart's going to be ruined forever. There's no way we can play sports. Nobody had myocarditis issues either. But if they did, that often happens with viral infections in general. It wasn't specific to COVID. And the media, what I called fear porn, governed the day, and candidly, behind the scenes, I was having conversations with commissioners as early as April, and I said, look, you're used to people being in favor of your sport. Everybody in the sports media is going to be opposed to you guys playing college football this year. They're not going to carry the water for the NFL. They're not going to say, hey, this is a brilliant idea. They're all going to buy into the fear and curl up in the fetal position and argue that there's no way this should be happening.
Well, as you know, Clay, I mean, it's been a long-standing dynamic in sports media that, sports writers, sports commentators, they particularly the ones who work at, say, major newspapers or major news organizations, right? They feel that sort of inferiority complex of we're not the real journalists like the people who work on, who go to Capitol Hill or cover the White House. So they feel that sense of, well, I have to do what the other journalists tell me to do, because if I don't, then I'm going to be seen as that fluffy sports reporter and not the hard journalist that I really am. And so that sort of that sociological element of the sports writing or sports media community plays a big role in their deference to what other people are saying that they feel they have to defer to. And so it's some of it's fear, some of it's that deference, some of it is just genuinely like, being terrified or whatever it is. All that to say that, what people like you and me and the people who listen to your podcast and the other people out there who had the same point of view need to do is to make sure that as we go through this, we're able to assess and have that after action report where we can say, okay, guys, let's learn from this. Let's learn about what the so-called experts told you that was right and what they told you that was wrong, and certain things that were unknown. So to take the example of myocarditis, I mean, you and I were more skeptical that was a serious issue, but you can understand risk-averse college presidents, risk-averse ADs saying, you know what, we've got to be concerned about this because I don't want to deal with the litigation, if you want to be cynical, or I don't want to deal with that on my conscience if somebody really gets sick, the kind of the Reggie Lewis type thing. So, do the MRIs, do the testing. Every, Power 5 university certainly has the ability to arrange for those tests. If someone's COVID positive, you can look to see if there's inflammation in their heart muscle and monitor it, which they did, right? Most of the big conferences did that. And that's what allowed them to get that relief that this wasn't a big deal. So I don't have a problem with, if they're going to be really risk averse, invest the extra money, since they make so much money off college sports, or at least the revenue sports, to invest in those tests, to see what's going on, make sure that nothing is going wrong. But to shut down the season altogether, that's stupid. keep an eye on it. And if it looks like things are going to go wrong, that's one thing. And remember, there were a lot of sports writers who said about the college football season, say, oh, this is so pointless. The whole season's going to get shut down after 2 weeks anyway. Why is anybody even bothering? And as you said, the season basically, yes, there were games that were canceled and things like that, but the season was played, and I think most people are pretty happy about that.
And to go to your point on the market-based capitalistic economy being the most efficient, which, by the way, all of world history proves, that's a whole other story. But for anybody who wants to study the history of economies and market-based decision-making in general, it's probably not a surprise if you adopt that line of thinking that the NFL, which had the absolute most money at stake and is the biggest business in all of pro sports, had the most successful season because not only did they play every single game as scheduled, all 32 NFL teams played all 16 games, but they did it on their schedule. They didn't even have, so far, the AFC and NFC championship games are Sunday. We're talking in the middle of the week leading into that. And then the Super Bowl, they've got 2 weeks to be able to schedule that. But right now it's scheduled, as it typically is, for 2 weeks after the Sunday AFC and NFC championship games. And a lot of them had fans present. But every television part of their game, which is where the biggest part of their revenue comes from, guess what? They did the best job. Biggest business does the best job in pro sports with putting their product out there for people to watch. And it's arguably the most difficult because of all the physical contact that goes into football compared to, let's say, baseball or tennis or something like that.
Yeah, that's a great point. As you were talking, I was recalling the European summer soccer season from last year, right? Not some of the leagues didn't play, but the ones that did had no problems, right? Everything worked out just fine. Yeah, there were some positive tests here or there, things like that, but the games that were played and worked out just fine. Yes, there weren't fans in the audience, and they would pump in the crowd noise on the broadcast, but otherwise it worked, and that was our first indication that actually this could be done. Or to give us the confidence, right? The real world examples that this could be done. So kudos to the NFL. I mean, definitely very impressive that they've managed to have everything run on time, and part of it too is, one thing we probably should take into account here is pro athletes, particularly football players. There's so much discipline involved, in being a pro athlete. In the NFL, it's just, you can get cut so ruthlessly and have your career cut short if you make one mistake. If you make it to the pros, you're likely to have that discipline and that maturity. Not everyone does, and we've seen some, notorious cases of that not being the case. But most of the athletes have really stuck to it, right? Whereas at the college level, it's a little harder, right? These are kids. There's a campus, there's parties, there's people who admire them and want to party with them. There's a lot more temptation when you're a college student to do the wrong thing. And so, it's impressive on both counts, right? It's impressive the college season managed to do as well as it did, even with a lot of interruptions. And obviously you look to the pros and say, hey, hats off.
We're talking to Avik Roy. Freeop.org is his website. Follow him on Twitter at Avik, A-V-I-K, at A-V-I-K is his Twitter handle. And this is the Wins and Losses podcast. I am Clay Travis. One of the challenges that I see that is the largest in the world of sports and other places, and I'm curious what you think about this, so much of our media is anecdote-driven. And the anecdote is used to justify the overall story. So, and I'll give you an example. If, as you mentioned, I remember, and this is unfortunate, and I feel for his family, there was a kid who died at Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina, of COVID or with COVID. It's not like I've reviewed his medical files to know exactly. But his death then becomes a front page New York Times article talking about the challenges of going back to college. The 2 million or 4 million or whatever the heck number it is of college kids that go back and don't have any issues at all. It's all about framing, in other words. If I wanted to write a story about how dangerous it is for kids to drive back to college at the end of summer, inevitably, every year, there are kids who die driving back to college campuses. that doesn't mean as a general rule that it is incredibly dangerous for those kids to be driving back to college campuses. Inevitably, every year, there are college kids that get the flu and die, the seasonal flu. That doesn't mean that all kids on college campus are in danger of the seasonal flu. Outliers occur, and as a data guy, outliers can be fascinating for you, I'm sure, to review, but they are just that, outliers. How much of our challenge in media today is using anecdotal outlier stories to justify a preferred narrative, such as sports can't happen because this college kid died, even if it's in no way representative of the larger data set? That is such a challenge, it seems to me, because the story of one death is more overpowering than sometimes the story of a million people being fine.
You know, what I'm thinking about as you go through that, all well said, is, you know, my takeaway from 2020 on that score is every high school in America should require that its students take a statistics class.
Yes.
Because statistics are the thing, they drive so much of life nowadays, especially because we have all this data being thrown at us because of the world we live in, and we just don't know how to process it, and we process it wrong, and that affects the way sports gets analyzed. That affects the way lawsuits happen, particularly the class action type lawsuits. It affects government policy, obviously. It affects medicine. It affects so many different things in our world. And if people had that understanding of statistics and how to separate anecdotes from the overall context of those anecdotes, you know, that would be an important service that would do a lot to just calm everyone down. I hope, you know, maybe that's Pollyannish or naive of me to feel that way. But I really do believe that if we could have a country where people were more, journalists in particular, more numerate, more fluent in statistics, it would be so much better. I mean, the story that really crystallizes to me everything that went wrong with the media coverage last year was the huge story, and I talked about it the last time I was on with you, in the New York Times, where it was claimed that there was a South Korean study that was purported to show that kids were infectious and it was dangerous to reopen schools. And this was plastered all over the New York Times. It was circulated to every school district in the country, and there was reporting afterwards that said that basically there were a lot of, you know, school principals, superintendents who wanted to open schools. They read that article in the New York Times and said, no, we're not going to do it. Obviously egged on by the teachers' unions. And it turned out that the article totally misrepresented the data, and that once the full data set came out, it was pretty clear that, in fact, kids were not infectious in South Korea, just like kids were not infectious anywhere else, that schools had been open and everything had been fine. But did the New York Times retract their story? No. Did the New York Times run another story saying, hey, we got South Korea wrong? Not really. I mean, they did write another article about South Korea, but it was very mealy-mouthed, and no reader who didn't already know what was going on would be able to know from that article that the New York Times had made a terrible mistake. But that's one journalist at one influential newspaper whose misunderstanding of scientific data led to something that impacted the lives of tens of millions of kids all over the country. And that's something that just should not happen. And I hope we can have a world in which statistics are more a part of the conversation, where when you encounter a fact or a journalistic assertion, we could do more to have statistics back it up. Now, that alone won't solve the problem, because, you know, the old line from Benjamin Disraeli, the old 19th century prime minister of Great Britain, was, there's lies, damn lies, and statistics. We all know from sports that you can come up with lots of different statistics to justify, anything that you want to believe, or anything that are your priors. So you have to go one level below that and really understand which statistics accurately measure things and which statistics don't. But just having that basic understanding of, you know, one anecdote is not, reflective of everything else. If one person dies in a car accident, it doesn't mean you should hide in your garage. If one person dies of COVID, it doesn't mean the world's going to end. That would obviously be a welcome development.